It's Anthony Semann from Semann Slattery, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Moss, the 2023 Semann Slattery Thinker in Residence. I want to acknowledge that we're filming on the land of the Gadigal people, which is part of the Eora Nation. And Semann Slattery maintains its commitment to undo the harmful and ongoing effects of colonisation, alongside Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues. So we're going to have a chat about prophetic pedagogy, and I want to refer to a quote by Loris Malaguzzi, if I may, where he attempts to define what he means, and he says, prophetic pedagogy knows everything beforehand, knows everything that will happen, does not have one uncertainty, and he continues and he suggests it professes everything, sees everything to the point that it is capable of giving you recipes, a little bit of actions, minute by minute, hour by hour. It is something so coarse, so cowardly, so humiliating of teachers, and it's a complete humiliation of children and their potential. Yeah. I kind of sense, I can see Malaguzzi on a stage with a bit of passion or perhaps indignation about this idea of prophetic pedagogy. I can see arms waving and maybe a sprinkling of anger. What might have preceded this statement? What was going on?
Well, if I remember rightly, this is taken from a speech he made, and it's in the book Loris Malaguzzi in the Schools of Reggio Emilia. And I think it's towards the end of his life, late 1980s probably. And I think what's going on then is he is being increasingly aware of trends that are going on, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, because he also has a pop, what he calls Anglo-Saxon testology,
right,
which I would see as being the other side of the coin to prophetic pedagogy, because it's about testing whether children have remembered what it is they've been told. So I think he's increasingly aware that this is kind of emerging in these very powerful countries, English-speaking countries. I mean, powerful not only in economic terms, but of course because of the English language, which is an enormously powerful tool for spreading certain ideas that are very prominent. On another day, I can give you my speech about the problem with the dominance of the English language and how it loses so many important ideas in translation. So I think that's what's happening to Malaguzzi. He's aware of the spread of high-stakes testing, standardization, but what is called by Pasi Sahlberg, he's a Finnish educator who now I think works in Australia.
Yes.
He calls it the global education reform movement, which is a sort of neoliberal wing of education, which is the symptoms of germ are things like standardization, narrowing of education, market logic, and high stakes testing. So I think he's picking that up in the wind, and it's making him concerned because it's totally at odds with his whole idea about education and learning.
I wonder whether this comes from a lack of trust for the system we exist in, and perhaps a lack of trust for teachers, that a level of control in both the process and the outcome is seen as a safeguard.
Oh yes, I think what has happened, coming back to neoliberalism, is the introduction of what's called new public management, which is sometimes called the governance of neoliberalism, which is the introduction into public sector activities like education of managerial methods from private manufacturing sectors, etc. So in a way, it's the equating of education with widget making and things. And the emphasis there is on achieving conformity to norm. Again, which is perfectly fine. If you're buying a car, you don't want it to fall apart.
Yes.
It's the same problem of confusing making things with educating people. Yeah. And other similar activities. So, and I guess within that, there's a huge issue of trust, and I think it pervades the public sector. I think these are things that we can see obviously in schools, in hospitals, in all sorts of fields, because the same things have been going on, which is this. Which is actually controlling people more and more tightly and through more and more rigorous methods of governing.
Do you My first part was, do you see a greater lack of trust as time moves forward, and how do we restore trust, particularly in those educating children? How do we begin to trust teachers more?
Well, as I say, I think it's more than trusting teachers. It is a breakdown, or a scepticism about trust, which is pervasive because new public management is applied throughout the public sector. So it's a way of thinking, a way of approaching, which is based perhaps on a false analogy on there. And it also, as with quality, it means that alternative ways of working have tended to be ignored. So huge amounts of money are poured into these human technologies, which would be the term, in developing measurements, programs, all these sorts of things, which then are supposed to be very tightly delivered. And in the process, it turns people essentially into technicians whose job it is to accurately and specifically apply a proven program. So that's part of it. It's actually changing the way we think about these people. But I also, so then you say, well, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is that you do believe that most people can be trusted in the right conditions. And then you have to say, what are the right conditions that enable people to do their jobs well? And again, we could go through some of those, but places like Reggio Emilia, I think, are very interesting to study because they ask exactly that question. They would say, we want to do something very distinctive in education. We are very ambitious, but we know we have to think about the conditions. We can't just say, off you go, yes, and we'll measure you because that's not going to work. So I think then you build up. And one of the things we have been talking about at the lectures here has been the importance of system and organisation.
Yes.
Not as the first starting point, that's politics. Through politics you decide where you want to go, so to speak, and then you can move on to saying, well, how do we get there? And then you really have to be very rigorous. It comes back that you're rigorous, but you're rigorous in a different way. So you say we need to build up a really strong, competent, there's a term, a competent system, which will support teachers who are working very closely together with each other in very collaborative ways. And then, so we have people like pedagogistas whose job it is to be there for the teachers, and we give teachers various conditions, not only very close relationships and team working and blah, 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 but things like, time to read, to think, to talk, etc. So yeah, I think I suppose the sort of new public management way is a quick and dirty way of trying to do something that actually doesn't really lend itself to that.
It's interesting. I would imagine this standardisation is dominated by the West and Western ideology. What's intriguing to me is perhaps how the educational project from Reggio Emilia has pushed back from that Western ideology. Or are they dancing in both worlds?
Well, it seems to me that there's a dangerous thing. Reggio Emilia has been just dropped out of the sky. In fact, they have drawn a lot on past pedagogical work, right, which in general in neoliberalism is one of the symptoms of neoliberalism is historical amnesia. We don't want to know what happened in the past. If you read Malaguzzi, if you listen to the people in Reggio Emilia, they make lots of references to past people and movements, so they are very influenced. Yes. And of course, there are a lot of people and movements. It's only relatively recently that there's been this sort of this convergence towards a particularly narrow and standardised form of education. There's been a very strong, what you might call progressive education tradition, going back hundreds of years, in fact. So in some ways, what Reggio Emilia has been doing is constructing a local project, and it does that partly through the strengths of its own context, but also on their ability to work with, absorb, discuss, see the relevance of other people and other movements' work.
Malaguzzi talks about a new intellect, a new form of intellect. When he talks of a new intellect, what is he referring to?
Well, I think what he's saying, when he's talking about teachers, and like everything else, he's really asking us what is our image of the teacher. And They would say one of the images, they're researchers, they're experimenters, they're co-constructors of knowledge, but they're also, he says, they should be and can be intellectuals. And I think what he means by that, they are people who are taking an intelligent involvement in the wider world. So they don't, they're not just living and working in a little bubble. They are actually reading, discussing, thinking about what's going on culturally, politically, socially, and not just doing that, but seeing how it relates to the education. Because he says very clearly that we don't, he uses the word mummified. We don't want a mummified education. We want a dynamic education that is relevant to the new conditions of the times. And if that is the case, then you have to have teachers and others who are trying to understand the new conditions of the time. I'm sure at present he would be he would be engaging with the pros and cons and the good and bad side of AI.
Yes.
That would be the sort of thing that he and the teachers would be getting to grips with and saying, well, what does all this mean? How can we use it, and what do we need to do to ensure it doesn't have a bad effect? They would be, just as they were working with computers back in the 1980s, because they could see that was on its way. So I think it's not so much a new intellect. He's just saying, I think teachers should see themselves and become intellectuals, and not perhaps not be too modest about themselves.
You write about real utopia, and I want to refer to a quote here by Levitas, who writes, "Crisis makes transformation necessary and possible. For those who think that utopia is impossible, what really is impossible is to carry on as we are." Do you think it's impossible to keep carrying on as we are at the moment in early childhood education?
Well, I would put it more broadly that, again, early childhood education is but part of the society. And so the society can't carry on as it is, and I think early childhood education can't carry on as it is, because that seems, I think, by the way, that there are people like Ruth Levitas who do a lot of work on the idea of utopian thinking, which I think is very important because it helps us to see that there are alternatives, there are different ways of approaching things. The idea of real utopias is driven by a guy called Eric Olin Wright, a sociologist from America, died fairly recently, who was very interested not only in the utopian idea, but actually how you achieve it. So he said it's all very well having nice ideas, but you've really then got to say how do we do it? And he spent a lot of time thinking about process, which is I find very useful to think about. And I suppose I think that we can't carry on as I don't think that's an original thought these days. The environment, if nothing else, won't let us do that. But there are many other things going on. We even read about these days that AI, despite its great benefits, could also be an existential threat. And we've now discovered that there are many possible existential health threats to us, which we've been very cavalier about. So, and militarily, we actually find that nuclear weapons are becoming a subject of big concern again. The world order has broken down into more and more aggression and violence and so forth. I suppose the current system of early childhood can stagger on, but I don't think it is helping us to address those bigger issues. I think education, early childhood education, should be part of us trying to find a better way forward, whether it's contributing to environmental thinking and practice, whether it's contributing to renewing democracy, whether it's helping to rebuild the solidarity that's been so painfully broken, etc., on there. So I'm sorry if you bung more money at it, and I do have this image of the zombie. It will stagger on, yes. But increasingly, the teachers, the parents, dare I say it, and the children will feel this is not really what we want. It seems to me at present, I could be wrong, that for many parents confronting early childhood and school, they kind of think that in many ways it's not what they want, but they're also terrified that if their children are not in this kind of conveyor belt, and if they fall off, they will be in the abyss. So they are torn between wanting something better and fearfulness about not staying with the system.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting us to have a greater trust in both the system and teachers, but also for introducing me to the language of that menu of possibilities. So perhaps we need to think more about those alternatives, and we'll move beyond this way of working and find new ground. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you.